Welcome back to yet another exploration of lost films from the 1920s, where I choose 3 lost movies to dive a little bit deeper into. We've gotten all the way to part 7, but there will be plenty more to go through because, unfortunately, there are a lot of 1920s lost films. And first up is one of the most sought after of all time. Lon Chaney was a pretty big star throughout the 1920s, often being in rather unusual movies for the time, and was especially known for his roles that required a ton of makeup. These were some of the most visually memorable of the decade, such as his portrayal of Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923 and the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera in 1925. Over the years, another of his characters has become pretty legendary as well. The man in the beaver hat in the 1927 movie London After Midnight. Alright, so here's what the movie was about. Chaney plays Scotland Yard Inspector Edward C. Burke. The movie opens with a murder mystery. An older man named Roger Balfour has been found dead in London. Burke rules the death a suicide after he finds a note near the body saying so. Balfour's neighbor and the executor of his estate, James Hamlin, says he doesn't think it was suicide. 5 years later, Burke revisits the case. Meanwhile, Hamlin sees that 2 creepy-looking renters move into Balfour's old house. This is the man in the beaver hat and another strange woman. Then, Balfour's body disappears, and it's thought that he might be a vampire. Burke then hypnotizes some of Balfour's associates, with the idea that, while under, they'll relive the crime if they had done it. First, he tries Balfour's nephew, Hibbs, but nothing comes of it. Then the man in the beaver hat hypnotizes Hamlin. While under hypnosis, Hamlin acts out an argument with Balfour over Hamlin wanting to marry his daughter, Lucille, and Hamlin shoots him. With this confession, it's revealed that Burke had, in fact, been the man in the beaver hat all along as part of a ruse. So, how did London After Midnight fare? The box office performance was pretty good, but not stellar. It certainly wasn't one of the most talked about movies that year, which is evident by the lack of attention it got in trade papers and movie magazines. Since I knew how much buzz it gets now, I thought there would have been more written about it at the time, but there really wasn't that much. Looking at the few short reports from theater owners, this not too shabby box office performance seems to be backed up. For example, one person said, "Lon Chaney is a sure bet for our theater, and he always draws a good crowd. And most everyone that does come out to see him leaves with a smile, saying Chaney is good, and that they enjoyed his picture very much. However, this picture is not above his average." Some reported pretty disappointing results, like this person that said, "Good business first night, but the late Chaney pictures fall down the second night, which proves his class of pictures are not what the public wants." This brings up a point. Just like now, spooky, scary movies weren't for everyone, which could be one reason why it didn't perform better than it did. Another report backs this up. This theater owner said that, "As usual, a very good portrayal of the mysterious, though so many dark scenes do not appear to please anyone except the deadheads." For these so-called grotesque movies, there was often a balance that had to be struck in order for it to be more mainstream, and London After Midnight may have just been too weird to do that. Even though Chaney's Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame would have looked disturbing to audiences, the story was tried and true, and viewers sympathized with the character and admired his bravery. But the Chaney movies that veered too much into horror isolated those mainstream viewers. Critics mostly complimented Chaney's performance, saying that it was up to his usual standard, nothing more, nothing less. but some had a problem with the story. For example, Motion Picture News thought that it was good, but not great, and also said that Todd Browning wrote it, and Todd wasn't up to his usual good form. He fails to attach much importance to the romantic side of the Yard, the heroine having little in common with the central figure. Chaney plays a Scotland Yard detective who works on the theory that if a crook is hypnotized, a crime may be solved, no matter if it occurred several years before the hypnotic test. The idea as exploited is fairly interesting, but it gets involved with mystifying detail. The New Yorker also criticized the story, saying, Mr. Browning can produce pictorial terrors, and Lon Chaney can get himself up in a completely repulsive manner, but both their efforts are wasted when the story makes no sense. A little more care directed towards smoothing out London After Midnight would have helped a great deal. A reviewer with the film Spectator took it a step further, writing, I do not know if I was expected to take it seriously as a treatise on the application of hypnotism to crime detection, or whether I was to regard it as a fanciful joke. My difficulty in deciding is caused by the fact that it is too ridiculous to be considered seriously, and was treated too seriously to be regarded as a joke. On this reasoning, Todd failed to hit whichever mark he aimed at. Then there is Lon as the humpbacked runt with all the teeth. I can't understand why he was in the picture. The makeup no doubt pleased Lon, but that is not sufficient reason. However, the whole thing is too utterly silly to warrant detailed criticism. There is about 1 reel of story embellished by 6 reels of utter rot. Overall, the amount of attention London After Midnight has gotten in the past few decades doesn't at all match the attention it got at the time. If all of Lon Chaney's movies had survived, a retrospective would most likely conclude that it was somewhere in the middle. It wasn't a big hit, though it did alright, and as we've seen, reviews for it were kind of mixed. The famous film historian William K. Everson, who died in 1996, saw the movie while it still existed in the early 1950s, and he said it wasn't really all that good. Unfortunately, the last known copy of London After Midnight was destroyed in the 1965 MGM Vault Fire, so we'll probably never know for sure what it was really like. So why does it get so much attention? I think it just comes down to how memorable the man in the beaver hat's appearance is. He's pretty creepy after all. If you're one of those people who are dying to get your hands on this movie, let me know in the comments if there's another reason. Oh, and for anyone interested in the details of London After Midnight, the full original script is available online. Then you can decide for yourself if the critics' comments about the story are justified. Next up is Aloma of the South Seas. I covered this one in my very first Lost Films video, but I have to make a slight correction. In that video, I said that it was one of the highest grossing movies of the 1920s. This might be an exaggeration. The commonly cited number for its gross is $3 million, which would have made it one of the highest grossing movies of the decade, but it's not entirely certain where that number comes from. A look at the Film Daily Yearbook covering 1926 movies shows that Aloma did well at a lot of first-run theaters. The numbers for Aloma here add up to about 510,000, and first-run theaters generally made up a big portion of the total gross of a movie. But keep in mind that this doesn't include all theaters in the US, and no theaters in other countries. So 510,000 is the bare minimum, though it definitely made more than that. So anyway, the story of Aloma of the South Seas starts with Gilda Gray, the star of the movie. Originally from Poland, Gray had been famous for quite a few years already for her specialty dance, the shimmy. She didn't invent it or even perform it for the first time, but she did help to further popularize it. And for the time, the shimmy was a pretty risque dance. It reminds me of a 1920 Harold Lloyd short called An Eastern Westerner, where Lloyd persists at shimmying despite it being against the rules of the dance hall because it was considered inappropriate. In the early 1920s, Gray did some stage shows, most notably the 1922 Ziegfeld Follies. She had also appeared in a few movies with minor roles, but Aloma was her true entrance into the medium. The movie was part of the 1920s fascination with exotic locales, with South Seas romances being a significant film cycle. Even though it was set on a Pacific island, it was actually filmed in the Caribbean. And because it was made when it was made, white actors with artificial tans rather unconvincingly portrayed the native people of the unnamed island. I found two pretty good summaries of the plot in the Indianapolis Times and Midweek Pictorial that I stitched together, and here it goes. The story tells of Bob Holden, a young English hero, reported dead, who returned from the World War to find his pal, Van Templeton, has married Sylvia, the girl they both loved. Not knowing Templeton tricked Sylvia, Bob goes to the South Seas with Sylvia's uncle, where he dissipates and stirs up so much trouble that the uncle sends him to a hut in the jungle. Holden has been disillusioned about the opposite sex, and has taken to drink. He has not lost all chivalry, and he defends a native girl dancer, Aloma, against a very tough gentleman named Red Malloy. Aloma is grateful and susceptible. She proceeds to fall in love with Holden, and goes with him as a housekeeper, giving the balmy air to her native lover, Nuitane. Nuitane resents this. He has a neat little trick of taking obnoxious white men out in his boat, pulling the cork and swimming away, leaving his passengers to the sharks, who have a liking for white meat. Obviously, the same is indicated for Holden. Bob promises to marry Aloma, but before the marriage, his sweetheart, Sylvia, comes to the island and discovers him alive. Her husband, Templeton, tries to make love to Aloma, thereby incurring the enmity of Nuitane. Amid the fury of a tropical storm, things straighten themselves out. Nuitane learns, just after he draws the cork from the bottom of the boat in which he is riding the waves with Holden and the treacherous husband, that Bob really doesn't want to marry Aloma after all if he can marry the American girl. Accordingly, Nuitane fights off the sharks and saves Bob's life. Templeton is not so fortunate and is fed to a shark. And since that summary ends with the shark, I just want to include this blurb from Photoplay that further describes some behind-the-scenes descriptions of that. A thrilling moment in Aloma of the South Seas occurs when a shark eats a sailor. If you want this thrill, you naturally have to take it synthetic. The shark cost $3,000. It was made of flexible rubber, and its insides consisted of a maze of electric wiring. Outside the body were several buttons which the actor could operate in his fight with the shark. It swims, wiggles its tail, and bites electrically. It might already be pretty obvious considering what Gilda Gray was known for, but few people probably went to this movie for the story. Whether or not they would admit it, they wanted to see Gray do a sexy dance, and this novelty proved enough for the movie's success. But it was one of those movies that didn't seem to have a very long run, since it was based more on a novelty than artistic merit. The consensus in film reviews from the time were basically that it was nice to see Gilda Gray do the shimmy in a skimpy outfit, and that there were some nice shots of beautiful scenery, but that was pretty much it. That's not to say that the reviews were negative. For quite a few people, that was enough to make it good entertainment, and they were satisfied. The supporting actors, Percy Marmont, Warner Baxter, William Powell, and Julan Johnston, got some small praise for the most part, but they were generally overshadowed by Gray, so it's not hard to believe that they didn't put their all into this movie. Some critics were negative toward the director, our old friend Maurice Tourneur, though it's hard to see what else he could have done with such a thin plot. Take, for example, this excerpt from Motion Picture News. The story is tawdry, slow and unfolding, and tenuous all the way, and it fails to create any excitement. Scenes will build to a dramatic climax, and then the punch disappears. As a result, Maurice Tourneur hasn't accomplished anything. A small sampling of reports by theater owners were mixed in terms of how much business Aloma did. That may have been due to the fact that because Gilda Gray was a stage performer based in New York, much of the country hadn't seen her perform and wouldn't have been motivated to go see the movie. While some may have seen her name and picture if they read popular magazines, plenty of others didn't read that kind of stuff, so she was a complete unknown to them. Another reason was probably the risque material. There were a number of people who reported that it wasn't all that inappropriate, though of course, in the grand scheme of things, sex did in fact sell with Aloma, though there were definitely people who objected. One theater owner reported that, repeating the words of a lady well up in society and a movie fan, this picture was the most suggestive and vulgar picture ever shown on our screen. And one bald-headed man, 65 years old, who never misses a show, said, that sure was the limit. The people of Fayette and vicinity are a very high-class patronage, and I must say that this picture did me a lot of damage. And a movie that emphasized dancing also didn't appeal to everybody. One commenter said that, when the farmers have to sell their corn to pay for husking, and hogs going down, and good horses are selling for $5 and $10, they are not very keen about shimmy dancers. But whatever the critics said, and whatever the reports from small-town theater owners, Aloma still made a big profit for Paramount. Even though it's unlikely that it would be famous today if it weren't lost, I still want to watch movies that were popular or impactful in their time, however briefly. Most of Gilda Gray's few 1920s movies are unfortunately lost, so you might see her pop up again in a future installment. Next we have Polly of the Follies from 1922. Constance Talmadge is one of those names that you hear a lot in 1920s sources, but maybe most silent film fans today would struggle to name one of her movies. Although in her early career, she did appear in the still famous movie Intolerance from 1916. She's one of those actresses that was very popular, but was never in a huge or influential movie whose reputation has lasted through the decades. And Polly of the Follies is a perfect example of a bread-and-butter sort of movie that was intended to make a modest profit, but not expected to become a sensation. These somewhat ephemeral movies make up the bulk of 1920s lost films, and the sad truth is that they would probably still be forgotten even if they had survived. That's not to say that they were bad or unsuccessful or anything, just that they wouldn't necessarily be timeless. The plot of Polly of the Follies was described in contemporary reviews as being zany and somewhat nonsensical, and reviewers were split on whether that was a good or bad thing. From the descriptions I've found, the structure of the movie was more episodic, similar to another lost film I covered, Penrod. The framing of the story is pretty standard. A small-town girl wants to be famous on the stage in the big city, and won't be dissuaded from pursuing her ambition. The main character, Polly, puts on an amateur movie show for children at the drugstore where she works in her hometown of Bowling Green, Connecticut. The local reform committee has been cracking down on this kind of entertainment, and the committee, which includes her uncle Silas, had already closed down the only movie theater in town. That's why Polly puts on a fake movie for the children. Her makeshift setup was just a white sheet meant to be a screen. Then she pantomimes a movie titled The Way to a Man's Heart, using the drugstore's advertisement cards as title cards, whose phrases were integrated into the movie. These phrases said things like, mild but they satisfy, and eventually, why not now, and don't cut the cuticle. One reviewer noted that the advertisements used in this scene were for real-life products like Lux soap and Fisk tires, and that it seemed suspiciously like what we would now call product placement. Uncle Silas and his followers break up the show, and he hits Polly. Meanwhile, a man named Bob Jones and his fiancée, Alicia Potter, have drunkenly eloped to Bowling Green and are waiting for the Justice of the Peace, who is in Uncle Silas's meeting, at the drugstore. They see Polly's show, and Bob promises to help her, suggesting that she go to New York. Bob and Alicia's parents then find them and convince them to hold off the marriage for 6 months. Polly leaves her job at the drugstore and goes to New York and gets a job with the Ziegfeld Follies. She also gets Alicia a job in the Follies as well. At her debut performance with the Follies, Polly gets stage fright and embarrasses herself. Alicia replaces her and is a success. While Bob is consoling Polly, Alicia comes in and breaks off their engagement, leaving Bob free to marry Polly. I want to add to that summary that there's also a scene where Polly does a comedic routine involving Julius Caesar, with herself burlesquing Cleopatra. It was sometimes mentioned as a notable scene, but it wasn't really described in detail, though I did find this photo of it in Photoplay. One source said that it was an imaginary scenario, though another one said that a scene where Talmadge wears Roman clothing, which is presumably the same scene, was part of a charity performance. There was also mention of her wearing a Dutch pantaloon costume for a novelty act, though I didn't see that detail anywhere else but one source. Another note is that apparently the actual members of the Ziegfeld Beauty Chorus appeared in the movie. Reviews were very positive about Constance Talmadge's comedic ability, often saying that without her, it wouldn't have been much of a movie. Though the story got a more mixed reception. Photoplay said, "This is one of the most uproarious comedies that has ever been permitted to roam about wild on the prosaic surface of the silver screen. It is absolutely crazy, making practically no sense at all at any given point, but it is gorgeously funny for all that." Motion Picture Magazine, however, disagreed, saying, "Prominent critics have said that if a thing is entirely unworthy, space should be given to other things, that it is not worth the space and energy it takes to declaim it. If this is true, we err in reviewing Polly of the Follies, the latest Constance Talmadge production. It is, in our opinion, entirely unworthy. The story, or lack of it, is not extraordinarily frightful. It is like most motion pictures you see where the little country girl comes to the city after giving amateur performances and eventually makes good. There is a departure from the hackneyed treatment of the plot after this, but it is so far-fetched and ridiculous that it does nothing towards saving the day. Constance Talmadge has a delicious sense of farce. When we say this, we are not judging her ability from this release, but from our memory of other roles. As we have said before, it is a pity she is not given opportunities in which to prove herself more often." A reviewer for Picture Play wrote of Polly's amateur movie performance that, "It is a brilliant idea, and I kept wishing the entire film had held to this delicious nonsense instead of drifting into nonsense that you were supposed to take half seriously. Constance, as usual, is the life of the party." There was also mostly praise for Anita Loos and John Emerson, the husband and wife team behind the story. Loos especially was known for writing clever titles for movies. While most comments about Loos and Emerson were positive, the Exhibitor's Herald thought that it was not up to the best work of these writers. I couldn't find any numbers for the box office performance of Polly of the Follies, but it probably succeeded in making at least a modest profit, if not a slightly higher than average one. Constance Talmadge, along with her sister Norma, were big box office draws in the early 1920s, so name recognition would have helped it along even if it wasn't her best. My guess is that Polly of the Follies was probably a pretty decent movie if you could suspend disbelief for the somewhat exaggerated plot, and if you can get over the cliched small-town girl goes to the big city idea. I'm especially curious about how those advertisement cards were incorporated into Polly's little movie performance, though. Pretty much everyone said that that was the highlight of the movie, and the cards being the punchlines seems like a pretty unique idea. So, which of these 3 movies would you like to see the most? I know London After Midnight is high on a lot of people's lists, but do you have a different opinion? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.